Test 1, 2. Oh, there we go. I think we're set. All right, I'll start us off here. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. We are pleased to have such interest in the electric rate study. We don't see so much interest all that often in the numbers and spreadsheets and that kind of thing, so it's kind of exciting to have a group here. My name is Jordan Stevenson. I'm on the Power Committee here in Kaysville. We've been discussing this issue now since February, and as a city, even before that, we had a consultant come in last year and offer a plan, and that kind of spearheaded a lot of this conversation. And because of feedback from the community, I think the council wanted more vetting to happen, more conversation to happen. As a result, this committee was formed, and just to quickly introduce us, again, I'm Jordan Stevenson. My background is I'm a certified public accountant, and I focus on utility rate making here in the state. And then we also have a good representation of industry personnel here on the board. Just coming in is our chairperson, Brock Thane. He works in the industry as well as a electric engineer. You want to introduce yourself a little more, Brock?
Sure. Brock Thane. I'm a PE electrical engineer by trade, and I do renewable energy for my day job. So.
Okay, great. And then I'll come over to John.
John Lovelace. I'm also an electrical engineer by trade. It's more in the satellite communication industry, but my passion is green energy and renewable energy. So,
thanks, John. And we have Patrick up here as well.
My name's Patrick Hine. I am in the high voltage material supply. So I am not a PE. I'm a greasy salesman, so I guess that's what you can say about me. But I've been in the industry for about 25 years. I know how the parts and pieces go together.
And then not up here tonight, we have Sean Chilcutt, who is also on the Power Committee, and Alan Farnes is just coming in, and he is actually a Bountiful Power employee and brings a wealth of experience and knowledge of the utility industry, and trying to make sure I haven't forgotten anyone on the committee. And then Susan Lee has been an integral component of all these discussions, council, on her role here. So thank you for being here tonight. We'll just dive in and discuss some of the background of what we've been doing. So here's the contents tonight. In the next hour, we'll talk about some of the background, how we got here. We didn't want to just come with a recommendation and not provide any kind of context for it. So we want to give a good foundation of how we got where we're at today. And then we'll get into kind of the overview of rate making, the philosophy behind how we went about what we did, and then finally the results of the model and the recommendations that we are bringing before the council, and then some of the next steps. So by way of background, one of the first things we talked about the very first night we were together is that we wanted to have some kind of guiding mission statement in discussing what priorities we should uphold as we talk about these rates. And so this was the mission statement that we've adopted, and it is that Kaysville City Power and Light's mission is to safely provide reliable electricity with superior customer service at a competitive price to the residents and businesses in Kaysville City. So that summarizes the priorities that we try to look to as guiding principles in the decisions that we made in this study and other topics as well. And so going back, as I said, a study had been brought forward last year about the proposals for solar, and as a result, this committee was formed to discuss that study and kind of bring new perspective to it with a Kaysville perspective and make a recommendation to the council. So February 7th, we had our first meeting, and by April 4th, after a lot more hours of meetings and investigation offline with utility personnel, and just I think all of us were researching the topic thoroughly during this time. We came up with kind of a framework, if you will, to evaluate the price of solar and utility rates in general, and that we presented on April 4th. All those presentations are on YouTube, so these dates, if you're interested, you can go back and find those. On June 6th, a preliminary rate model was presented for review that incorporated that rate-making framework. By the end of June, we had finalized kind of the residential class proposals for the rate design, including the solar credit. And then by August 1st, we had incorporated the commercial and industrial customers to that model. And then on September 5th, we as a commission voted to approve the results and brought those forward to the council for their recommendation as well. And then in October, we kind of finalized the timing of wanting to have enough time to present this and all the background to all the citizens who are interested here in Kaysville. And that's why we're having this meeting tonight. And there will be another follow-up meeting December 5th, I believe. And so if we don't get all the questions answered tonight, we're hoping to take notes of all the questions that we aren't able to answer. And then December 5th, there will be a follow-up meeting to kind of circle around and try to make sure we tighten up any loose ends. Okay, so now we're going to just get into the philosophy, the framework that I discussed. And to do that, I'm just going to talk about kind of the high level of rate making as we see it. And so there's three main steps to rate making that we analyzed. The first is the overall revenue requirement that our power company here in Kaysville has. The second step is to come up with a cost of service. So once we know what the revenue requirement is, we need to know how we're going to kind of divvy that out among the different customer classes that exist here in Kaysville. And then the third step is the actual rate design, which is coming up with the specific rates that customers will pay at that point. And so I kind of compare this to a pie, if you will. So the revenue requirement is just developing what's the total pie that we need to collect to make sure that our utility is able to provide safe and reliable service. The cost of service study then takes the pie and kind of divvies it out by customer class. And so we have in Kaysville residential customers, commercial customers, and industrial customers, and there's different characteristics of behavior. And the goal with that is to make sure that the cost causation drives the revenue we're trying to collect from customers. And so all of this study is cost-based. And so we go into the study to look at different characteristics and decide how much each of these classes is costing the utility so that we are able to fairly allocate the revenue requirement to those classes accordingly. And then finally, the utensils represent what kind of tools we use to collect that revenue requirement. So it could be just a fixed monthly rate, like your cable bill might be, or it could be all volumetric rate. Today that's what it is, or maybe a mixture of both. And there's various tools that utilities have used to collect those costs. I think on the water side we have a big annual fee each year, right? Am I quoting that right? So that's one tool to collect it. On the utility side, it's a kilowatt hour rate, which is very common. So that's kind of your overview. So we'll get into these steps. Step one is the revenue requirement makeup. So to determine what our revenue requirement was here in Kaysville, we looked at the financial statements provided by the city finance department, and we were trying to forecast what 2018 expenses are going to look like, and so that the revenue that we're collecting from citizens covers those expenses. And so we looked at all the operating expenses to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity and provide customer service as well. We looked at the administration expenses, any debt requirements that we have as a utility, depreciation on assets, and then any other kinds of capital needs that need to be considered. And this makes up the total pie that we need to collect as a utility. Moving on from there, we take that total pie, and now we need to decide how are we going to collect that revenue from specific customers? And to do that, we broke the costs up into the three main functions that our utility serves. There's the generation function, where power plants generate the electricity. The transmission function is there to get the electricity from the power plants all the way to our utility here in Kaysville. And then the distribution function is everything from the substation to the meter on your home and all the costs that go into that. And once we have those costs functionalized in this matter, we can begin to look at how they behave and come up with the cost causation principles that drive the rates. So going up to generation, we look at, is there variable costs embedded in our financial statement that are related to that generation piece? And what costs are fixed in that piece? And so we're kind of getting back into our economics and accounting classes, but we wanted to give you the whole picture just to make sure everybody who is interested understands the background to how we came up with these rates. And so the idea here is that we want to have a clear understanding of what causes our costs to go up and what causes our costs to go down. Is it usage? When I use more electricity, how do costs to the utility go up? When I put solar panels on my roof, how do costs to the utility go down? All of the behaviors our customers are doing each day, we want to make sure that the bill is driven by the underlying costs. And that cost causation principle is kind of our guide when it comes to designing these rates. And so on the variable costs for generation, we determined that the energy usage of each customer in Kaysville drives certain variable costs of generation. For example, fuel is one that is driven by total output the utility sends out. So our generators need natural gas or coal or whatever the fuel might be to produce more energy. And so that's a variable cost. And then on the fixed side, there's all kinds of infrastructure and O&M that we traditionally refer to as fixed. And in the utility rate-making world, I like to think of fixed costs more as long-run variable costs. So today, those costs might not change, but over the long run, if I as a customer change my behavior in a certain way, those long-run costs could be saved if we don't have to build as large of a generation plant in the future, or if we don't need to transmit as much electricity in the future because I don't require as much energy on my home. And so we're looking at those long-run fixed costs as kind of long-run variable costs as well. And so we decided that total output also drives a portion of our fixed costs in generation, but not all of our fixed costs. And so to understand how these fixed costs behave, we have to introduce a new bucket, and we're calling this one peak demand. This is another behavior, if you will, that drives costs to the utility. And to understand peak demand, I like to refer to it as, or use an analogy of a bus. And so if I decide to start a busing company, and I am transporting customers, we'll say I have 24 passengers that I need to carry over a day. And depending on, so that's like my total output, is that 24. So I know I need a bus to do that, but if I have one customer every hour, all I need is one passenger seat, and I can take that customer where he needs to go. Every hour I pick up a customer, I drop them off, I get my 24 customers. But if at 5 p.m. I have 20 customers, then one passenger seat's not going to cover me. So my bus is going to need to have 20 passenger seats to move those customers at 5 p.m. And that's what peak demand is trying to capture. Transmission lines and distribution lines have to be sized appropriately to meet the peak demand. And so we're breaking up the fixed costs by total output, but also by peak output. And the method we use to decide what that breakout should be is called a load factor. And I'll just briefly talk about that a little bit later of what that load factor is. Going ahead, we did the same kind of study for the transmission function and then the same kind of study for distribution. So we have variable costs and fixed costs. And then on this one, though, we added one extra bucket, and that's the customer bucket. And the reason we need this for distribution is because there are certain costs on our financial statement here in the city that aren't driven by usage, but are driven by just adding customers. And those would be the function of just billing a customer or providing customer service, putting a meter and a service line on a customer's home. Those things vary. As we add one new customer, that causes those costs to increase, whether or not electricity is consumed. And so we introduced this new bucket called a customer bucket, and the fixed costs are then shared between customers, and then we also have the rest of the infrastructure that's broken out by energy and peak demand. And once we have all of the costs that exist in our total pie, the revenue requirement, functionalized, and then we know what behavior drives that cost, we can begin to craft a bill that sends those cost signals so that our customers know that if I increase my usage in a certain way, my bill will reflect the underlying costs of the utility. And so that's the cost causation principle that kind of guided our study. And I will mention really quick that this study was all based on accounting costs. So these are all items that are recorded on the financial statements and are simply accounting related. I will mention there are other interests that aren't on accounting books and records that might be of interest to the city, but those were not considered in this study. And so, as I said, once we have everything broken out into this organization, we can decide how to craft the bill. So on the energy-related costs, if I increase my kilowatt-hour usage by 1, and that causes certain costs to go up, I've identified all those costs, put it in this energy bucket, if you will, and now on the bill, we can have an energy rate that is meant to collect that specific bucket of costs. And so we take the total energy-related costs divided by how many kilowatt hours we expect the city to bill, and that would be our kilowatt-hour rate for the test period that we're talking about. On the peak demand-related costs, the bill would reflect a peak demand type behavior. And so, for example, what we could say is in Kaysville, as we looked over our past years of history, our peak has happened between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. And we can say between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m., we're going to have a new component of the bill that reflects that peak type behavior. And if you reduce that peak behavior, then that portion of your bill goes down. And if you increase during the peak time, then that particular portion of the bill would go up. And so the cost principles guide the bill behavior. And then finally, the customer charge is simply a basic service fee, very common in the utility industry, that's not related to your usage. It's just simply those costs that we incur just to have a customer on the system. All right. So I want to just go through an example and talk about how understanding costs this way can help design our rate study. So a typical customer in Kaysville may have a pattern that looks similar to this, where in the morning we have kind of a peak, and then in the evening the usage in Kaysville drops a little bit for the typical customer, and then in the evening there's a peak again. And that evening would occur for us between 5 and 9 p.m. That's when we see our customers peak on average. Now, if we have a solar customer who installs an array, we'll say an array large enough to cover their total usage on that. So they're backfeeding enough to offset the bill under the current net metering design. What you may see, and what I've just drawn this, but this is just to represent the general principle, is that in the morning before the sun begins to produce energy on the solar panels, that curve is going to follow pretty much what a typical customer looks like. The big dip you see there in the middle of the day is energy being produced by the solar panels, and it dips so much as to even be backfeeding into the system. So that's how it's dipping down below that horizontal line. and providing a credit throughout the middle of the day. And then in the evening, depending on the array and the direction of the solar panels, those panels start to produce less and less as the sun goes down. And when they stop producing, the customer starts to behave like an average typical customer again. And in that peak time, usage goes back up to around where the typical customer's usage is. And that's where we talk about the bus principle. And so as we design a bill, we want to make sure that that bucket of peak-related costs is calculating correctly the bill, and the costs that are being saved are not reflected on the bill, and the costs that aren't being saved still remain. And so that's what this kind of demonstrates here. So just taking that net metering customer, and we'll walk through the scenario, the variable cost of generation to us as a utility, we would avoid as that customer generates their own electricity. And so that savings that comes through on the bill would be avoided as well for the customer on their bill. On the fixed costs, the portion that is related to total output would also be avoided because total output is not as high because that customer is producing their own electricity. But the peak-related costs, going back to that time frame between 5 and 9 p.m., would not be avoided because the usage remains the same. And so we'd want to make sure that the bill correctly reflects what costs are not being avoided and what costs are being avoided. And then moving on, the transmission, same kind of thing. The total energy-related portion would be avoided. The peak portion would not. And then on the distribution, it's a little bit unique. And the reason is, on distribution, everything from the substation to the meter is required to have solar production coming back onto the system. And so in that case, the distribution piece is unavoidable, just because we can't eliminate having lines and poles. So that does not go anywhere as far as the costs go. All right. So I'll talk about kind of the results at this point of what our study yielded. So for ongoing operations, our long-term capital plan as a utility and the cash reserve policy, we determined that the total revenue requirement was approximately $14.7 million. So on an annual basis, that's how much money the utility needs to operate and to continue to provide reliable and safe service in the long run. We functionalized that into those generation, transmission, and distribution functions. So generation and transmission represent $9.67 million of the $14.7 million total. The distribution related is $3.91 million, and then the customer distribution related to just serving customers is $1.12 million to come up with our $14.7 million. Then we looked at how these costs behave based on fixed and variable. And the $9.67 million of generation is 44% fixed and 56% related to production. Those numbers were pretty easy to come up with because the UAMPS cooperation that we participate in actually bills us and shows on the bill the percentage of fixed and the percentage of production-related costs. So that was a good service that UAMPS provides. And so we end up with $4.26 million of our UAMPS bill is fixed, which means it doesn't vary by usage. The production-related costs are $5.41 million to sum up to our $9.67 million. Now the fixed costs, you'll remember we were splitting into those that are driven by total output and then those that are driven by that peak principle that we talked about. And to come up with that, I talked a little bit about this ratio we used to split it. And so we used a load factor, which is a common type of allocation method used in the industry to allocate these types of costs. And all it consists of is what our average hour of demand is for Kaysville over the peak hour of demand. And we look at that relationship. And in our case, the average hour represents about 38% of what the peak hour is. And so we have a ratio of 38 going to total energy usage and then 62% related to peak. And so that fixed costs is split down even further to $2.64 million going to the peak bucket, and then the $1.62 million going to the total energy bucket. And on the production side, as it's variable and related to usage, 100% of that goes to the energy bucket. And so the bus size that I'm talking about a little bit has now $2.64 million of investment that we'd want to behave according to that peak hour. And then the remaining 1.62 and 5.41 would all go into the total usage kilowatt hour rate that behaves as it currently does today. So I keep wanting to stop and see if there's any questions, but then I'm worried that we might not get through this. So save your questions, and then as we circle back here at the end of the meeting, we'll open up the floor and have everybody ask their questions. Okay, and this is just breaking it down. So $2.64 million related to peak, our 5 to 9 p.m. service, and then $7.03 million related to just total energy that we provide to each customer. Now moving to the distribution-related costs, we have $5.03 million remaining. If you add that $5.03 million back to the $9.67 million before, we're getting back to the total pie of $14.7 million. So I'm just trying to wrap it all together. But the $5.03 million remaining, we've identified specific components of our finances from the substation down to the customer meter that are driven by demand, and we ended up with $0.93 million. And then the energy-related consumption was $2.98 million. And you'll notice those don't add up to the 5.03. That's just because I haven't brought on the customer portion yet, so I'll bring that on momentarily. But again, we break that out by peak related and then total energy related. And the energy consumption side is all 100% energy usage related. And here's how much we're adding to these buckets that we're going to use to influence the bill. And then on the customer-related piece, we have $1.12 million, again, that we're calling out here. All that sums up to our $5.03 million distribution. Added to our transmission and generation, we get back to the $14.7 million we need to collect as a utility to make sure we're funded adequately. And again, just to highlight the distribution-related piece, $1.12 million is driven by our customer count, not our kilowatt-hour usage. And so items such as a meter and a service drop and billing and customer service all are related to how many customers we have, not necessarily how much kilowatt hours each customer uses. So that we put into its own bucket, and we come up with the customer charge based on the amount of customers in each commercial class or each customer class. Okay, so in summary, after doing all those allocations, now we can come up with our rates. And so we have total peak-related costs of $3.22 million. We have total energy-related costs, which is the lion's share of $10.4 million, and total customer-related costs of $1.07 million to come up with the $14.7 million we are after. And these are all then allocated to our customer classes based on those classes' contribution to that cost. So if our commercial classes use a certain amount of total energy versus our residential class, we can use that to allocate to them the energy bucket, if you will, because that's what drives that behavior. If they contribute a certain amount of peak demand to our total bucket, then we can allocate that appropriate level of peak demand to the commercial class. So now we're taking the pie, and we could subdivide it out based on everyone's contribution to the total pie. Does that make? I hope that makes sense. And then this is the result in the end. We have a residential class here on the top row of this table that has $6.6 million of the energy-related piece of the pie we need to collect, then $2 million related to peak, $850,000 that we'll collect in our customer charge, for a total of $9.5 million of the total revenue requirement we're after. And then the commercial classes, same kind of categories, but we'll collect $4.9 million from our commercial customers. And then finally, we have small amounts of revenue that come from industrial street lights and area lights to all sum up to our $14.7 million revenue requirement that the utility requires. Okay, so finally, this is the end of the line. We're getting to the actual rates. And to most appropriately reflect this cost behavior, we came up with a mechanism that we think is most appropriate, and that is a time of use type rate. So the peak demand bucket would be reflected in the bill between 5 and 9 p.m. The total energy bucket acts the same as how we're billing today. As you increase your kilowatt hours on total, then that kilowatt hour bucket would be driven by that, and then the customer charge we would introduce as well. So we have $6.56 million of total energy-related costs. We would anticipate billing around 97.5 million kilowatt hours here in Kaysville. And so it's a simple division to come up with the kilowatt hour rate we need to charge to get our $6.56 million from the residential class. Now, to come up with the solar credit, again, we go back to which costs are avoided. And on the energy costs, almost everything is avoided. The only portion of it that's not avoided when we're back feeding energy back onto the grid is the distribution piece. So from the substation on, our distribution, the power lines and the poles don't go anywhere. We need those just to take the solar power and to deliver. So that's the portion that we're not giving a credit for. And in this scenario, it's about a 2-cent difference between the two. So 4.6 cents is what the solar credit would be for back-fed solar. And then we have $3.22 million in our peak bucket. And again, we would look at how much we anticipate billing during the peak period. And we have a total demand of 26.77 million kilowatt hours that here in Kaysville we'd anticipate billing during 5 and 9 p.m. So again, simple division to come up with the rate that we need to charge to make sure we collect all of the peak-related costs. And that gives us 7.7 cents. And so during 5 and 9 p.m., not only would you see an energy rate of 6.7 cents, but then also a 7.7 cent rate would be added during 5 and 9 p.m. to reflect the sizing component of the rates. Just for a little perspective, today our rate is around a little over 9 cents. You'll see that both of these, so the 6.7 cents is quite a bit lower than today's rate, but you add in the peak rate and you end up being averaging out to around where we're at today. So the idea would be that under time of use, an average typical customer would see a neutral impact on the bill. So if you're using just as much as you use today and we go to time of use, if your usage pattern is average, then there's no impact on your bill going to time of use. Now on the peak-related costs, similar idea. If there's backfeeding going on between 5 and 9 p.m., then we can avoid those peak-related costs of generation and transmission. And so there is an added credit for the solar that's provided during that peak-related window. And in this case, if you take the 4.6 cents and add it to the 6.3 cents, then you're up to close to 11 or 12 cents of a peak value of solar, of energy provided in that window. And then finally, the customer charge we calculate is $8 per month of a simple basic service fee. And if you add up the revenue we'd expect to get from the $8 and all of these particular rates, you would end up with the 9.6 million or some odd, I can't remember exactly what it was, of revenue that we need to collect from residential customers. Okay, and with that said, this time of use design that we think is most appropriate in the long run, we are not proposing to go to this design next month or in January or whenever it is the council decides to implement any changes. And the reason is that this requires a smart metering technology that is going to be installed, we anticipate is going to be installed within 2 to 3 years in the city. So it's not available yet. But we are recommending to the council that going to this is the best option when it's available. And for now, we will keep our current type of rate structure, and we've just revised the rates based on the cost behavior. So currently we have 2 tiers in Kaysville. Everything under 1,000 is billed a certain rate. Everything over 1,000 kilowatt hours has a added rate. And based on that same structure, we calculated 8.6 cents and 9.7 cents for each respective kilowatt hour usage. And then we introduced the customer charge. And the interesting thing is on the kilowatt hour rate, it's actually lower than it is today, but that's just because we're rolling some costs into a new bucket, a customer bucket. And so we'll collect some of it in a fixed cost, some of it in a kilowatt hour cost, and end up getting the amount that we need to collect. Now, based on the financials and the expectations going forward for the utility, this rate study results in a $3.37 per month impact for a typical customer. It's about 4% on average over a year to customers to be able to make sure the utility is operating as needed. Bruce, when was the last rate change done in Kaysville, just for context?
It was a 2% decrease 3 years ago. Last increase was 7 years ago.
Last increase was 7 years ago. Yeah. So that's just solely driven by the financial statements and the outlook looking ahead and how much kilowatt hours we expect to be able to bill. And so that's what goes into that increase. Nothing related to solar or rate design or anything like that. And then looking ahead, we just based on, as we said, the unavoidable related costs, we calculate the solar credit to be 6.6 cents for all future customers. Now, it's important to understand for those who are getting in and calculating how this impacts if you have an array on your house. This currently would be netted monthly as it currently is. So at the end of the month, we'd look at how much was backfed, if any, and the 6.6 cents would be the amount that's credited to the backfed kilowatt hour usage. If no energy was backfed during the month, but your bill was reduced because you were still producing energy, but you weren't producing more than you used during that month, then you'd be offsetting your retail rate on the bill, and you'd get the full retail rate benefit. The 6.6 comes in when you offset all of your usage and more because you have an array that large. I hope that makes sense. So the 6.6 cents is not for all of the kilowatt hours produced on the solar panels. It's just for the amount backfed. The impact to a typical customer, and in Kaysville, it's around 7 kilowatt, a 7 kilowatt array on the rooftop is a $3.93 per month decrease in solar credits on average versus where we are today for solar. So that's a 5% impact. Now, talking to policy on this, we are recommending to the City Council that if you currently have solar panels on your roof, you will not see any change from where we are today. And that's just based on understanding that a lot of customers made certain investments with certain expectations. We know that our power utility has been very forward with stating that there's a change coming, but we feel like it's a fair proposal to grandfather in current customers who already have solar on their house. So this would be in effect after 2033 for current customers. That's a 15-year time frame. Most of the solar customers here in Kaysville have installed solar panels on their roof within the last year and a half or so. And we looked at the metrics on payback and what was fair as far as what to expect from a return on investment. And around 15 years we thought was a fair time frame to leave rates unchanged for current customers. That said, as soon as the City Council, if they do approve a change, approves a change, say, for example, it were effective January 1, 2018, then any customers who install solar and become net metering customers after that time would be subject to this new structure on solar going forward. Okay, and more on what we're proposing for a transition. So like I said, we need AMI metering in order to do a time of use type rate design. So talking about that change from where we would be at between January 1, 2018 and when AMI comes on, we have that temporary Schedule A rate design. Like I said before, there's little change between that rate design and going to time of use if you're a typical customer. On the solar transition, depending on how the solar arrays are designed and how much energy is being backfed during the peak, we'd anticipate there to be more drastic changes for solar customers than just for a typical residential customer. And so what we've decided to propose is that Schedule A will apply to all customers who install their solar panels after this proposal becomes effective. And current solar customers remain on full net metering until 2033. And then when time of use becomes available or is implemented, we anticipate between 2 and 3 years from today, the solar customers who are subject to the new rate design would move onto that time of use rate when it's effective. And so at that point, we calculate that based on peak usage and peak production of solar panels, the average customer here in Kaysville would see their credit for backfed energy go from $833 per year down to $659 per year. So currently, where they may be offsetting 80% of an annual bill, that would go to 62% of the annual bill. And then the final point, we wanted to make sure that any change would be really clear from the start so that there wasn't any ambiguity for any customers who are deciding whether or not to invest in solar. And so we propose providing a bill calculator tool, if this is approved, that as soon as the effective date occurs, customers can use this to calculate what their bill would be on Schedule A, the temporary schedule, and then finally when time of use is available, they could calculate what it would be based on the time of use as well. And so that there is no surprises 2 or 3 years from now if the council decides to implement this policy. So that's all of the residential related changes. We also studied commercial customers, and I'll just show the rates here to make the record complete. We've implemented 3 tiers. That's the same as what exists today for commercial customers. One new thing that we have introduced is splitting up the commercial customers into more homogeneous type groups. So today, the commercial class, which ranges from commercial customers who have 638 some odd kilowatts of demand all the way down to very little amounts of demand, all together in one group. We're trying to provide better cost design and signals by splitting it into groups. So commercial A class would be smaller commercial customers between 0 and 9 kilowatt hours of demand that are really similar to residential customers in total usage, even maybe a little small, but their pattern is different throughout the day because they may close at night and not be home when commercial customers would still be on. So And then the customer charge would be $11 for commercial A customers. And then there would be no demand type charge for commercial customers. The result of this rate change is between 3 and 5%, depending on the customer size. Commercial B customers, all the larger customers between 9 kilowatt hours and 38 kilowatt hours of demand. This represents approximately 50% of the customers here in Kaysville. They would see, again, the same three-tiered rate system. The customer charge is larger. That represents the infrastructure costs to serve those customers. And a demand charge is implemented of $11.59. And a demand charge is there to represent the type of infrastructure that's driven by spikes in demand that occur throughout the day. And again, this is between a 3 and 5% impact on the annual bill. And then finally, for commercial C customers, everything above 38 kilowatt of demand, we have the same kind of tiered structure. The customer charge on this goes up to $59 per month, and a demand charge of $11.59 through 2018. And then the full cost in 2019 is currently around $14.49. And this, again, is a 3 to 5% impact on an annual bill for a commercial customer. And then on the industrial class, our industrial customer in Kaysville would have a kilowatt hour rate of 3.3 cents. The reason why it's so low is because the industrial customer uses an enormous amount of kilowatt hours compared to the other classes we've been discussing. So when you take the energy bucket and you spread it over a lot of kilowatt hours, the rate you need to charge is quite a bit lower. The customer charge is $90 in this case. It looks a little bit high, but in the case of this customer, it's actually a pretty small component of the monthly bill because of how much energy is being billed. And then a power charge of $9 through 2018. It would step up to $11 in 2019, and then full cost in 2020. And it represents a 5% increase. So all of our classes are kind of seeing the same percentage of increase to the annual bill as a result of this study. So in summary, what we are proposing to the council are these new rates for residential, commercial, and industrial customers, a Schedule A transition period beginning whenever the council decides to implement the new rate structure until the time of use is implemented, a grandfathering for current solar customers until 2033, meaning no changes to the mechanism for customers who have already made that investment. Future solar customers who make the investment after this plan would be implemented would be subject to Schedule A when they become net metering customers, and then eventually the time of use rate structure when it is implemented. And then finally, we'd provide a bill calculation tool for all Schedule A customers who will eventually be moved to time of use rate design. And with that, I'm going to turn this slide over to our chairman, Brock, just to talk about looking ahead what the next steps are going forward.
So thank you, Jordan, and thanks everyone for coming out today or this evening. I just wanted to put out there that just some of the things that we're looking at, and when this meeting occurs every month. So the first Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. here, you can expect this meeting. As Jordan mentioned, all of our meetings are recorded, and you can grab them on the YouTube channel. But just some of the things that I wanted to go over and just really point out is the number one thing that I would say is all of this is accounting that's driven all of our recommendations. So we realize there are soft benefits to some things that are out there. I just want to make sure that everyone's clear that it is strictly accounting that we are using. The other thing is I did want to point out that you guys seen the timeline on there. and the amount of effort that goes into creating this. We all are Kaysville residents, and this is a volunteer board. And so just keep that in mind. You know, we are here for you, and I know that we're right at the 7 o'clock hour, and it shows that, you know, there's another meeting. What I would say is that we will get to those, and your comments are crucial to us. So going back to, you know, some of the things that we have to tackle as you know, energy changes. There are big changes coming as, you know, people are changing the way that they want to buy power, and we are working on that day in and day out. And so some of the things that we are looking at, and to encourage you guys to come in on these Tuesday board meetings, is we are looking at a potential, and it is on the agenda for this evening, solar cap. We're looking at, you know, maximum system sizes. We are encouraging, you know, some of these the sizing, and I'm assuming that we'll get into some of this later this evening. We are encouraging proper sizes by the accounting principles. So we are, you know, kind of challenging some of the industry leaders that are putting out, you know, some of these different types of, you know, not just solar, but other, you know, sources, generation sources to properly size their system. We're looking at fees. We're looking at what type of equipment goes onto the grid, and how do we compensate for those types of equipment that comes on the grid. We're looking at what do we do for solar and commercial and industrial, so we have not addressed all of those types of things. Those are just some of the things that we are looking at. We would love to hear if you guys have some ideas that you would like us to look at. We'd love to, you know, hear your thoughts on it. What I will tell you as well is we have ran a sensitivity analysis against other municipalities and Rocky Mountain Power specifically. And what I will tell you is Kaysville is unique in the fact that if you go back to our mission statement, we stand behind that, and I can tell you that we don't fund our general fund off of our power rates like other municipalities, and that approximately, and Jordan, correct me if I'm wrong, approximately we're 15% lower on an average rate than if we were part of Rocky Mountain Power. So we have looked at that as well, just to put that in there. And is that number pretty close, Jordan? Okay. So with that, we would love to hear your guys' feedback, your comment. So I think from there we can switch this around. And when you come up, just if you would say your name, and then if you could tell us, you know, I guess your thoughts, your comments, and then any recommendations that you'd have. So.
I had one question.
If you would just say your name first, please.
Tom Summers.
What was that? Sorry.
Tom Summers.
Okay, perfect.
And my question was, so we talked about, you talked about, it was really clear, it was good, but the one thing that wasn't quite clear to me is the way the net metering will work starting January. And you were saying we've got the amount, and then the net metering will be, you said that if, okay, so the question I have is, if you go, you said it's on a monthly basis. So the only way you would be paying the 6 cents receiving the 6 cents rather than 8 cents is if your kilowatt hours was negative in the month. Was I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Okay. And the only recommendation, the thing I would wish you would do rather than this is just keep the net metering. I guess you might have to raise the monthly the fixed cost in order to do that. But it would, that would seem to encourage more people to do solar. I don't have solar right now, but anyway, that would be what I would hope you'd do.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Brian Goff. I'm a residential user. Just a clarification for me, if you will. When you look at your chart here, we see that the initial rate, the first rate for customers is a little higher than residential customers than for business. And then as you use more power, it gets lower for businesses and a little higher for customers, residential customers. And I assume from your explanation is that that rate is based on peak power, and because most businesses close in the evening, they're not taxed at the same rate. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. And then another component businesses have that make them a little different is they have a demand charge that would be more related to their peak that residential customers do not have. But sorry, continue.
Okay, and so at the same time, I assume you've lumped all businesses into the same category as being regular businesses that close at 5 and not looking at restaurants, fast foods, who have their peak hours 5 to 9 and even later. Just a comment, an observation. So is that correct?
Right. So on the commercial, the biggest differentiator we looked at is just total demand. So you're right. We didn't split the commercial class up by time of demand, but more total demand required, and that's a 15-minute increment. So I think the big difference between the peak behavior and how we're billing it with commercial is we have the capability to bill a demand charge, and what that does is it looks at that particular business's highest 15-minute usage for the month. And so if a restaurant, say, had a big peak at 8 p.m. for 15 minutes, we would look at that and assess a demand charge on that usage. And so that capability gives a little bit more flexibility to how we bill commercial customers versus residential. On residential, the meters aren't as sophisticated to allow that kind of billing. And so the tiered rate is kind of an attempt to reflect a peak type behavior. It's not the most accurate tool of doing that, but with the tools we have in metering, that's what we've had for some years. Like we said, as AMI becomes available, we have a more precise billing mechanism that we'd propose between 5 and 9 going forward. So
if it were a perfect world, it would be different, right?
Right.
Thank you.
And Bruce, feel free to correct anything we say. Bruce is the real expert over here. So.
Hi, my name's Richard Johnston. I've got 3 questions. I was just wondering, I've got 2 240 outlets in my garage anticipating electric cars, which means if I don't want to be paying city rates to charge my cars, I would want to expand my system. Now, is that going to nullify the grandfathering if I expand on the system that I put in 2 years ago? Or am I still going to be part of the grandfathering? I mean, will that be considered a new installation?
My understanding is if you installed a new system, you would lose your grandfathering.
Okay.
On the new system.
On the new portion?
Not on the current system. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's why we're doing the grandfathering. So you already have a solar array. Okay. And whenever you put that in, you have that. Now you want to expand.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
So more than likely, you come into a unique area where you're not going to lose your grandfathering, but you're not going to reap the benefits of your new system.
So the grandfathering is only going to apply to the original
system. It's only going to apply We had a
We-
draw line in the center.
We should research this because I'm not sure that's correct.
And that's true.
Yeah, how would
That's
that
the
be
way-
accounted? How would it show up on a bill? All that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think we should get back to you on that. And so we'll take that as
Because it's a unique
question.
I mean, that's unique.
Because I know John, he installed my system, and he added more panels on, and he's got a lot of power now, but he's got 3 electric cars too. And that's something I'm anticipating is going to electric cars, and that's why I asked. I currently have it's a 7,100 watt system, and I still haven't been able to figure out this customer history thing with the $5 per month charge. And that's actually my second, well, it's actually my third question, but why haven't we had a bill calculator before? Because when I asked about it, apparently there was like, what is it, the first April after the first year that everything goes through and it's all normalized in the accounting to, what's the, what am I paying, getting credits, and how do I even see that? Or is that just not something I'm never going to see? Because the bill doesn't show that.
Right, that's what you have your $5 minimum
Okay,
charge.
Now,
So,
the minimum charge, does that mean for that month that I was only charged the $5 minimum charge, that means I generated more power than I used?
correct.
Okay. All right, so it's not like if I eked over by a little bit, I'd still have, I'd have the
Yeah,
$5 plus.
If it went positive, yes,
So
you
anything-
just
yeah.
get that charge.
Because most of the months since I've installed 2 years ago, just have the $5 charge.
Correct. So you've been,
Okay, so
Overproducing.
say, for example, there in February, I had $10.79, but that includes the $5 charge.
well, yeah, it's the kilowatt hour charge, yeah. If the total kilowatt hours you use is less than $5, then you get the $5 charge. If it's more than that, then you get the, whatever the charge is per kilowatt hour, yes.
I wanted to know whether it'll cover the first $5. Okay, that's my, and also too, is there going to be a problem? Guess I'm being a pioneer with Powerwall from Tesla, and I'm just wondering is it just going to be transparent for me? Because in a perfect world, I will be banking the power during the time when I'm producing, and during the peak, I won't have to be paying the higher rates. And that's not something you guys will even be able to know about then, right?
No, it won't matter. It'll be behind the meter. It'll
Yeah.
just lessen the kilowatt hours you use. And then when it goes to time of use, then, you'll be able to lessen those kilowatt hours used during that time and save money on your bill.
Because those kilowatt hours would be more valuable to me than getting the credits back.
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to incentivize by lowering the
Yeah.
peak.
Yeah, it's only the power that backfeeds.
Okay.
And I think worth mentioning, just future things to consider as you're looking at battery storage. And again, I'm just really trying to encourage people to show up in our future discussions. What I'll tell you is there's other values that, not just sending your kilowatt hours, but also being able to sell your power factor correction, all types of things that battery storage that we haven't, being a pioneer, that we haven't explored, but we are going to explore on this board. So would love your input and to see some
Solar
feedback.
City doesn't actually sell stuff in Kaysville, and so they're taking the time figuring out how to do the interconnect before they even go to to find out whether it can be signed off by the building people. So, so thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Marvin Thurn. Along with his questioning there, if I'm producing more and I just pay the $5, is that extra charge or the extra amount that I've accrued, is that added to the next month
Yes.
automatically?
Everything you overproduce, is a credit for the next month. So
It's added to the
you don't
next
get
month.
any charge until you finally go positive past, where you originally started. If you're going negative, you don't get anything but a $5 charge until you surpass your original reading.
Until it drops.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Larry Nybo. Just really quick, specific question. Does the grandfathering apply to commercial as well?
So we'd have to follow up, but as of right now, we have not addressed commercial or industrial solar, just residential specifically.
Okay. And then, and also similar question, if we're putting in a solar array, and if we modify or expand that, similar question, will that nullify the grandfathering?
So we'll follow up on that. Just other utility companies, they typically, just so you know, that does nullify the grandfathering, but we need to discuss that and get back to you.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
My name's Jason Broadbent. My circumstance is that I've recently signed up solar panels to get installed next month, hopefully. But here's my overall thoughts, since you asked for thoughts. I'm very disappointed that it's apparent that Kaysville is going less solar friendly, or that you're proposing we go less solar friendly. I made this decision based on an investment standpoint, and I have a break-even point. I'm glad that you're at least proposing that we're grandfathered in for 15 years, but after that, the investment that we put ourselves into is going to be much less. The break-even point for new people signing up is going to be, you're going to see a lot less solar going in Kaysville. So if you're deciding to go less solar friendly, that's the ultimate consequence, is there's going to be less solar panels going up. And you can decide whether you like or don't like that. But I'm disappointed because the investment that I've just signed up for is now going to be less of a good investment. And so I hope you reconsider. I hope you see the benefits of producing power and the reason that we all did it. And so I'm disappointed that we're going less solar friendly, or is my thoughts.
So real quick, can I flip the question for you?
Sure.
What would your recommendation be? So you're saying grandfathering is at 15 years. If I could just flip it to say, what would your recommendation? What did your cross break-even point be?
Well, yeah, mine's slightly less than 15 years, but had I known, so here's my thought, had I known before I signed up what was happening, I wouldn't sign up, because now you're talking people's break-even point, instead of being 10, 12, 13 years, for new people to sign up, it's probably going to be 13, 14, 15, 16 years. And so where you're going less solar friendly, if I could reverse my decision right now, I would. But I've already paid half down. I'm committed to solar because I've put half down. I'd love to go back and say, hey, give me my half back, because Kaysville's going less solar friendly. So my recommendation is do more for the solar people. I mean, what percentage of Kaysville City residents have solar on their house? And this is who you're proposing to hurt. You're proposing to hurt the solar power people that put good money and good investment into something, and you're lessening our investment.
So can I ask a question? How are we hurting you?
It was pretty obvious.
No, how? Tell me your point of view. How are we hurting you? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, you're already getting a subsidy from the federal government for your purchase, correct?
Correct.
I don't get that. You're also getting a tax break from the state of Utah, correct?
Correct.
You'll also increase the value of your home. You'll have an array on your home.
Okay.
That will still produce power. So again, I'm wondering how we're unfriendly to you.
Because you're proposing that in 15 years, instead of dollar for dollar, I'm going to be like 60 cents for a state rebate. It's still costing me $16,000 to put these solar panels on my home that was supposed to produce for me about an 8% return based on the calculations of your 9% or your 9-cent kilowatt hour. Now we're talking in 15 years, that's going to go down by 40%. And so I feel bad for anybody. You're going to have a lot less solar panels going up in Kaysville, because now it's not a 10-year break-even point or a 12-year break-even point. It's 15, 16 years. So you're definitely hurting solar by making these choices in Kaysville. It's apparent, and you can't say otherwise. So my overall thoughts is I'm disappointed. If I could reverse my decision to do solar in Kaysville, I would. But I'm in that unique position where I'm going to be installed next month, and I've put half down. So.
Okay.
Could I just make a comment on that? So before I joined this commission, I would be standing right there with you, and I was vehemently against doing anything that would hurt solar. And I'm a solar customer myself. I totally am on board with more solar. Everyone should get solar. But looking at the numbers, Kaysville is part of this group UAMPS, and the way we buy power is so unique. When we buy power, we get it for an extremely good deal when the city buys power. And then going back to that little load curve that Jordan had shown, solar is producing power when we're not at our peak. And when the way the power agreement is when we're not at the peak and no, we can't use our subscribed, 45 million watts is what we've subscribed to, we have to sell it back on the open market for a loss. And it's just a few pennies of a loss, but we're getting it for such a good deal, we lose a little bit, and it ends up still being really good power. But this weird, strange model actually pencils out that solar, it's not valued during the afternoon. It's weird.
That. You're talking about the good of the whole, but it's going to hurt the people who have invested in solar, yourself included.
Right.
So you're okay with the good of the whole, but it's going to hurt you, and that's where I'm disappointed. It's going to hurt me, and even though it may be better for the whole, I think maybe the grandfathering should be longer. Maybe rather more than 15 years, maybe you go 20, 25, because the small percentage of your residents in Kaysville that have put on solar are the ones that are going to be hurt. So maybe my suggestion is grandfather it longer than 15 years, because it's such a small percentage. Do you know what percentage of Kaysville residents have solar? Is that something you've studied?
We have 1 megawatt of solar currently, approximately 1 megawatt of solar on the grid.
Roughly 2% of the customers.
Roughly 2%. So, yeah, that's the issue.
Right?
Yeah.
It's 145 residents.
So 2% or less or whatever is using solar, we're the ones getting hurt. And so let's make that grandfather longer.
So I just wanted to add to that. What this is your recommendation. So when you come up, please do give us recommendations. This is public comment. This is the law. So keep that in mind. And we are taking notes, and we are going to, address all of these concerns. So please make a recommendation. So that is perfect. So your recommendation would be 20 to 25 year grandfathering.
I would say because it's a small percentage of the residents you're talking about with solar, don't hurt us so bad. Push it out further. And I understand peak hours and that you're going to change the whole system for the whole and everybody. But what you're proposing for the small percentage of solar users is it's going to hurt us. So my recommendation is don't hurt us so bad.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions before we go any further. You guys talked about generation and transmission. Is that something that Kaysville has any investment in at all, or are we just buying on the open market there?
Gary can answer that one.
No, we have take-or-pay contracts in on 8 different power resources that we have, and that's what we're talking about. During the middle of the day, we have excess resource already.
So all right. So that kind of changes versus what we would see on the open market then, right? Because it seems to me that if I look, I did some research on Pacific Power and Rocky Mountain Power as far as their peak hours, and they looked like their peak hours, based on lots of business, were ending at 5 or 6 in the evening, right? So businesses have their air conditioners and lights on during the day, right? So are we in an odd situation in Kaysville because we have a high residential?
Very much so,
Yeah,
yes.
It's air conditioning load is our big driver.
Because if we were buying on the open market, we'd be getting the best deal during that solar peak, right?
Yeah.
But because we have these other business arrangements, we're not, right?
Well, right. We have take-or-pay contracts, so yeah.
Okay. All right. I just needed to understand.
This is Tom Summers again. You had asked, and I forgot your name, but you'd asked him, how would you turn this thing around? This is something kind of unorthodox, and I know we're not taking a vote or anything, but you asked how would, if you asked him, if we turned this around and had your recommendation about how to do this differently. If you remember, I made a recommendation. And what my recommendation, because I do believe we should encourage solar. And I understand I'm not one of the people with solar, but I hope to be sometime in the future. But I think in order to encourage solar, because I understand your rate structure and everything makes sense, the only way you could do this and have it all work out is you would increase the fixed cost and then give all the solar people, continue to give them that net metering thing. So just a question to you, would that make sense to you? And go ahead.
Sorry, I'm tuned out of listening.
Okay, you were listening to me. Okay. I thought I'm sorry about this, but just a quick poll here. Because I think I have an idea that I don't know if everybody else is crazy. Just a curious question for everybody. Would you be in favor of saying, right now you're saying you charge $8 a month to everybody, but the solar people don't get pure net metering? My recommendation is, I don't know the dollar amount, but instead of $8 a month, something higher, and the solar people get net metering. So, who would think that's a good idea? If you don't think it's a good idea, raise your hand. I thought that might be the case.
Subsidizing.
Cost even to the net metering. And that's what the per month charge is all about. It's not about the change in usage, if I understand what you're telling me.
Right. Well, the fixed cost applies to everybody, whether you have solar or not. And so more and more people that go on to solar, I would imagine the way you can make that work, you have to increase the fixed cost.
Tom, let me just point out real quick.
Yes.
So one thing that might inform that proposal, it's similar to a proposal recently brought forth by Rocky Mountain Power. It's a little different. But Rocky Mountain Power brought forth a proposal saying we're going to move all of the solar customers to their own class. We're going to charge them, I think it was around a $15 customer charge. We're going to charge them a $9 demand charge. Those two things behave more like fixed costs. I may be a little off in the numbers, but those behave like fixed costs. And then the rest was a kilowatt hour rate that could be net metered. And I think what might inform that decision a little bit is that net metering rate dropped all the way down to around 3 cents or something. So the more you put into the fixed cost, the less opportunity. I mean, right now you're getting a 9-cent rate. That rate falls more and more and more the more you put into a fixed cost. And so you'll be getting 3 or 4 cents potentially, just throwing out numbers, for the net metered solar instead of 9 cents. And so the economic, that changes the economics a little bit. And I'm talking about Rocky Mountain Power's proposal, but I don't think the solar community liked that idea very much.
Well, I think that the objection was you were going to charge the solar people this fixed cost, but not everybody else. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you charge everybody a higher fixed cost in order to facilitate more solar, so that the solar gets the full net metering. Because you got to pick up I understand it doesn't grow out on trees. It's got to get from somewhere, and that's what I'm saying. Is you want to maximize the amount of solar just because because we all love it, because it's good. We want to increase solar. And that's, if I turn the tables, and that's my recommendation to you.
That's perfect.
Anyway.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
My name is David Packer. I'm a current have solar system, a very large system. And I guess from my perspective, I applaud what you've accomplished. I think the structure that you're proposing is significantly different than what it was a year ago. I very much like the idea of partitioning costs and charges based upon the function. I think it's in society's interest that solar be subsidized for a while to get the technology off the ground. I also think that technology at some point has to stand on its own, or it isn't. If it's not viable, why are we doing it? And I think you're navigating that transition period. I think Kaysville City has done an outstanding job in facilitating solar, because I couldn't do it without the grid to plug into and to pull off of during when it's dark. And so I think you're headed in the right direction, and I applaud what you've done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mark Postma. I just wanted a little bit of clarification. For the net metering, my understanding was that until you hit that 0 mark, where where you're drawing more power than you're actually putting back into the system. Everything you generate and put back in the system simply reverses your meter. Is that correct?
So it's real time. So what happens is when you're generating power,
correct.
The visual way to think of that is you spin the meter in one direction. Mm-hmm. When you're using it, you do it the other. The spins in the opposite direction.
Correct, and that's a one-to-one rate. It doesn't change in reverse. It's not the same amount you put in is the same amount that goes. Either way, it's the same direction. So when we talk about the 6 cents per kilowatt, is that only once you have gone negative? Correct. Okay, so
in 1 month.
In 1 month, correct. Okay. And so the average impact. Remind me what the average impact was going to be for the average customer. $3 a month.
Around 5%. That's over a year.
And that only and that only applies to when you're generating surplus energy beyond what you use during the month.
Right.
So okay, so we're talking $36 a year.
Right.
$360 over 10 years. So okay, I just wanted to verify that because I'm trying to do math in my head, and sometimes
you're
right. Okay, so over a 10-year period, we're looking at maybe a $360 difference. We're not looking at a $3,600 difference or a $5,000 difference for ROI. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Corey Lauder. I'm a current solar producer, actually. I produce more than I use. And I just had a couple of questions just to clarify. First of all, you said there were 145 current solar customers? 160. Okay. I appreciate that kind of information. That would be really great to have. I didn't realize you could subscribe to the YouTube channel. I've been trying to go to the city website to pull down the minutes and kind of monitor, and honestly, I haven't been able to see anything there. They've been kind of delayed. So my recommendation would be to try to have that stuff more current, just as a recommendation. Secondly, I just wanted to talk about when you said current customers, and you mentioned those that were installed with a net meter. Is that correct, or was it those that had already applied for a permit? Is that what's the correct definition? Because it seemed to me like, as a recommendation, it would be those that had submitted a permit by X date, whatever date you decide to pick. Because oftentimes those that are waiting for the electrician or waiting for the shipment to show up or whatever else, there's a myriad of other things that could happen when you're trying to install, and I did install my own. And I can speak with some experience about the delays that occur from everything from the mail to running to Home Depot 1,000 times. So it would be, to meet a recommendation, it would be the permit, the actual filing of the permit be that trigger. The next question I had to do with the AMI, the smart metering system you're moving to. Some of us, not all of us, but some of the more recent installs were required to have 2 bulb meters on our system. Would that be a future 2 bulb meter purchase I'd have to make as a user?
I'm going to flip
that. They would both have to be AMI if we're going to read them remotely.
So I have one that's a redundant one that I was told doesn't do anything other than read error, and I've got one that's actually my net meter.
No,
I'd have to replace both of those?
The production meter reads everything your solar panels produce.
Okay.
That's a production meter.
And so according to the net meter agreement I had to sign, I'm responsible for those expenses of replacing those? Or is the agreement going to be replaced with a new agreement?
So
No, we're not. Your meters, nobody's going to have to pay for their meter. We're going to replace the meters. You're not going to have to pay for them again.
Okay, because
whatever meters are out there on the system now will be replaced with AMI meters.
And I won't be responsible for paying those. Those are built into the costs that you've talked about. Okay, and again, I'm just going off my net metering agreement.
New people that, like you had to do, the initial costs, they'll have to pay for their initial meters.
The initial ones, okay. So for both meters, in my case, I have 2 meters, a production and then the net meter. Those are both replaced without additional charge to me. Okay.
And just one note, sorry. It is on the agenda, and so again, AMI meter fee is on the agenda and something that we are still considering as far as solar and how do we accomplish it and and not just solar, any new new developer or any of those types of things. So just note that this is still in discussion.
Okay, so as another recommendation for those that fall under this definition of grandfathering, I'd like to recommend that those that are in that group would not have to pay for the upgraded technology of whatever it is that you're moving toward, if you should move to that. My next question is really more of a question because I don't know the answer. During for our net meter agreements that we're required to sign, there's a renewable energy credit waiver that we bequeath over to the city. Have those been included? Any of those type of credits been included into this calculation at all?
They're not worth anything. They're not, but in the future, if they are, then we'll use those credits. But they're currently worth nothing.
Okay.
There's no market for RECs.
So if they're worth nothing, why is it in the agreement?
Because in the future, we assume with the policy changes and things that they may be worth something someday.
Okay, so that's a what if then. Okay. All right, so if we have a what if built into there, if and when those credits do become a more viable revenue source, will that be considered in future revenue discussions, I'm presuming?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. I didn't know. That's why I'm asking the question. Finally, I just want to tell you guys, you're doing a bang-up job. So I'm not here to complain. I'm really just trying to get information. I really appreciate your service for what you're doing. I know it takes a lot of your time, and to hear me drone on about how much I appreciate you taking the time to do this is not really meaning much, but it is appreciative. I think you're doing a great job in going through all the numbers and explaining it the way you did, so thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Denny Fifield, current solar customer. Got a couple of questions and then maybe a recommendation. My understanding from what we've discussed, Kaysville buys their power on bulk. They don't generate their own. Is that correct?
We own percentages of different power plants. So yes,
So you own.
We have take or pay contracts on a certain percentage. Yes,
okay.
We don't buy it on open market.
And so part of that is we're dealing with a fixed cost right there for the energy. And as a solar producer for my home and possibly at good times kicking it back into the system, does that energy that goes back into the system, does that go directly to Kaysville power users in theory? Because once you generate electricity, it's generated or nothing, right? Mm-hmm. So is it...
Right. And that's
how does that work?
And that's kind of why it's kind of if we already have excess power and you're putting it back on there. That's what we're talking about. We're taking a loss on everything that's extra put on there because we already have excess.
Okay.
And so that they have to.
And from what I understand, the AMI meters are more dynamic. You basically pull information at a much greater rate than right now, where you have to send somebody out to wave a wand at them or something like that, correct?
Yes, you get voltage and all those things too.
And you could pull the information at, say, like every 15, 20, 30 minutes,
right?
Whatever. My recommendation is, because from what I'm seeing is we've got our peak time, which is from 5 to 9 p.m. because we are a residential city. We're not an urban city. But we still have businesses here. My recommendation is if there's some way that, especially with the AMI stuff that you're looking at, that is there a way that could be negotiated with those power companies that we own interest in? To say, okay, we've got X amount of solar people here that are helping us produce energy that's costing us nothing, basically, to kick in and use to our business customers who are, at that time, using more power for their AC units. And the residential people are, they got the power. It's, my peak time on residential, and you know this, is in the afternoon. That's when I get the most bang for my buck on solar. But if there was a way that we could kind of equal that out somehow, I would suspect that, it's use it or lose it, but if there were a way that we could do that, my recommendation is to help with that power generation that we have available, that we aren't having to technically pay for. So
yeah, it's fixed. There's no taking it here and there. You have it. If it's producing, you take it at that time. Like you said, there's no storing the power. So
And I think worth noting, to that point, what happens is we have a surplus that we have to sell. And if, let's just say we were a solar only, let's say that we put in large solar scale, we'd be subject to that pricing. And that pricing is not close to, I believe it's roughly, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, I think you know, and Bruce, it's roughly about 3 or 4 cents.
Yes.
It's approximately. So if we were to surplus your solar and sell it, for an example, on the market, it would be at a decreased rate than what we're already at on these rates. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, okay. All right. Just one other thing. I haven't regretted solar one iota. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mike Schuler, and I'm a Kaysville resident, and I do have solar. I wanted to thank you for your volunteer service doing this. I can tell you've put a lot of work into it, and I really like the idea of smart metering, and so I think getting the most out of that makes a lot of sense. I had a couple of questions. I wanted to ask, why was there a limit on the size of your system? Somebody made a comment that you're going to limit the size of a solar system.
We're going to have a discussion in the next meeting here on what that limit should be.
Why would you want to limit it at all?
I can give you one example. So I have a fairly large array on my house. It's about 11.4 kilowatts. Yet the distribution transformer that feeds me and my closest neighbors is a 50 kilovolt amp transformer. So if I have a very large array and my neighbor does too and my neighbor does too, there's a certain time of day where our houses are using very little of that power, and that's going to max out that transformer very quickly. And so we do have to, just because of the physics of sending power forward or backward, we have to limit the size of the system based on what the infrastructure can handle feeding backwards. And that's just one example. So there has to be some limit that we have to decide on, and that I think for currently, I think it's 15 kilowatts, and we just have to have more discussion on what that should be.
Okay. If I could make a recommendation, I sort of think 50 and 100 years in advance, not just next year. And I can see that there's going to be some issues. But imagine a world where everybody in Kaysville got solar and they all had home batteries and we didn't need Kaysville City Power.
Bingo.
I mean, to me, that would be nirvana, okay? And we wouldn't have all these, language. A drunk driver wouldn't affect my life, And so I really see a forward-thinking system, and I would hope that you guys have that vision when you're thinking about it, because I wouldn't limit somebody. I would say if you want to build a power plant on your land and work with our AMI technology, we'll help you if you're willing to help us beef up the transformer that's limiting that step and make it so that we can power Bowman's and Smith's and, Kaysville City. How great would that be if our citizens were that engaged in the process? So please do not limit. That would be my recommendation. Whatever you're thinking, think a future without fossil fuel and without Kaysville City Power. I mean, it would be awesome. Or just a maintenance organization just to make sure that all the transformers were correct. And then the second question I had was, will this AMI technology allow for home batteries? For example, I don't think everybody has to go and buy solar, but they could get a home battery, and with your market price, they could sell back all of their technology, all of their power during your peak, and they could take away your peak. If everybody in Kaysville bought one 7.5 kilowatt home battery, you wouldn't have a peak. And so, incentivize that kind of thinking. And what if Kaysville City said, we'll help everybody buy a battery? Or what if they called a big corporate battery maker and said, we're going to have our own battery and take away the peak? That's what they're doing in Australia. That's what they're doing around the world. Let's think that. I would love to see Kaysville. I've lived in Kaysville most of my life. And I would love to see Kaysville in the news for like a positive thing, like not a drunk driver taking out our power. I would love to have them say, Kaysville leads out in the country, and Kaysville is a model for how we can do it in San Francisco and New York. And so that'd be my comment. And don't limit the solar. If people are trying to get a home battery, they're trying to do solar, they're trying to do this, I kind of agree with that man that said, I made this investment. He's an engaged citizen. He took volunteer time of his to come to this meeting and make comments. Let's all work together and kind of make it better so that we don't have to be bound and beholden to these power companies. That would be my comment.
Hi, my name's Greg Fisher. I'm a residential user. And I want to talk about the other 98% rather than the 2% that have the solar at this point, okay? Mostly it has to do with that pie that we're cutting up, the revenue requirement. Now, I'm just looking for clarification on how we came to that 14.7 and what's built into it as far as inflators or efficiencies, other things that way. Because the whole model is based on that beginning point. So I'm just going to sit down and listen to what you can tell me about it.
Sure.
Okay?
So I can tell you, just based on the city financial statements, the largest component of that is generation and transmission. It's about 9.7, if I remember correctly. And that's just billed from UAMPS, and they take care of all the generation and all transmission. And in addition, they provide a forecast of the upcoming year. I don't know exactly all the metrics they put into their forecast, but we could do a little more research. So on that one, we relied on UAMPS to provide the forecast of the $9.7 million. The remaining around $5 million is based on the administration and O&M and all of the costs that are on our city financials that are published. I think we are in a June year of reporting. Is it year-end June, Bruce, I think?
It's April.
Oh, is it April? Year-end April reporting period. And we basically relied on the most recent 12-month reporting period with some, we looked at each line item on the financial statements and what the trend has been over the last 5 years. There's a few items that you can see are just kind of shrinking and disappearing. Some of that is debt related for debt that we've retired. Others kind of bounce up and bounce down but are pretty steady. And on O&M and other types of items, we used a inflation factor of around 1.5%. We verified that with a third-party analysis firm called Global Insight that looks at utility costs and provides estimated inflation going forward. And the 1.5% seems reasonable for what the industry expects. And that's kind of how we came up with the 2018 $14.7 million.
Thank you.
You bet.
My name is Brig Lewis, and just a couple of quick comments. And I suspect I may not make a lot of friends here, but that's okay. Personally, a couple of years ago, I went through the cost of solar and wind, and they are not cost effective without subsidies. They cannot compete without subsidies. They cost too much. I just need to understand that, or they do. When Rocky Mountain Power has power, they have what they call spinning reserve. They have to have that so they can meet the peak demands when things happen. So they have generators that are simply running, and I don't know if they're using that to heat water or to do something else with, but they have to have that. And if we have solar, and it's done at, say, between the hours of 10 and 12 during the day, and we need the power, well, that doesn't really help Kaysville because it doesn't come back to where it can help. And I was reading today that some of the large power companies are concerned that when they get 1 to 2% of their power by solar, it begins to cause them difficulties. And the infrastructure cost, like John mentioned, if you run things backwards, solar power cannot pay for those transformers. Those are not cheap. You know, that if they say, well, we've got to go this way, who are you going to sell the power to? you don't have that many consumers at the time the sun is shining. So if you've got any comments on the 1 to 2%, you have to limit it. If you don't, it's going to mess with the entire power structure of Kaysville. I don't know if you've got any more comments on that one. I appreciate your example on those transformers.
Now, the transformer example I gave, so 1 to 2% is really just in the noise of the measurement. It's not affecting anything electrically. But once you start increasing to 33%, 40% of the customers having solar, like Hawaii is experiencing, then you start running into these transformer issues. And so we have several years before these actually become issues. We want to discuss them now and have a solution in place now so we can mitigate these problems once solar penetration becomes much higher. But then at the same time, you add battery storage and you say, okay, you can't backfeed more than so many kilowatts. That doesn't prevent the customer from not putting up more solar. They can put up as much as they want as long as they don't backfeed more than a certain amount of watts at a time. So you could put in a gigawatt of solar if you wanted to, as long as you don't backfeed more than 10 kilowatts or 15 kilowatts, whatever it is. And then along those same lines, actually that's a tangent. I'll leave that here for now.
That was interesting, and we should keep going.
Okay. So talking about solar and battery storage, a lot of power plants, we actually learned this at a UAMPS conference this summer. Power plants with rotating machinery that are generating power, they actually are putting in battery storage so they can run their equipment at peak power, peak efficiency, and then when the demand drops, they keep it at peak power, charge up their battery, and then they completely shut the generator down, off, and their maintenance runtime it freezes, and their maintenance schedule lengthens out, and they can save money on costs and money on maintenance just because they have this extra battery storage. So I think it's going to be really interesting in the next few years. The conventional fossil fuel plants, they like batteries. Solar and battery, that makes a really powerful combination that you can have these, intermittent power sources that can be flattened out just because you have a battery now.
It will be interesting to see what the technology does. But right now, with a lot of your spinning equipment, you can't really shut that down. If you've got a steam plant, you don't shut that off for 6 or 7 hours. You can't. It takes so much time for it to stabilize.
But a gas turbine, like a natural gas plant, they could shut it down. And they are. And they're pairing that with battery storage.
Okay.
So, but you're right, a coal plant probably wouldn't shut down. A nuclear plant, well, that's a different story. So,
okay,
anyway, I could go on and on.
I appreciate what you're doing. Keep looking, because we got to protect our infrastructure. We got to protect what we've got. If we didn't have Kaysville City Power, the people who are doing solar couldn't afford it simply because the batteries and the other things they have to buy. A friend of mine moved to Texas about 4 years ago, and he put solar. He did batteries, completely independent solar. His total system cost him $30,000. And we don't have that kind of money. Even Kaysville doesn't have that kind of money. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, once again, Larry Nibel, just in behalf of, and I appreciate you clarifying that this is the open forum for discussion, and as you guys are considering the changes to the commercial impacts of this, as a company, we have already invested into the process of this, of discovering what with our install. If you, number one, when was the date of the grandfathering published? I just recently received that mailer card, so I don't know when was the date of the January 1st, 2018 Is that just tonight?
Just to clarify, the January 1st, 2018 is just a hypothetical
A
date.
proposal.
The council, the city council will be the group that actually approves this plan if it is approved and set an effective date. I believe that it's on their agenda December, what date are they meeting? The first meeting in December, and it potentially could be effective January 1, but that's not.
It's being proposed, right?
Right.
When was that published, that proposed date?
I believe we discussed that either September 5th or the next meeting in October, first Tuesday of October.
Okay. Do you have any data on how many commercial, we talked about the 2% residential, but commercial, do we have any
We just
data on
have
that?
one solar customer, one solar commercial customer today.
Okay. So I guess my request is just as you're considering that, a suggestion of the leniency of the grandfathering, maybe time, could also be considered leniency on expansion. Much of our research and what we paid for to date is we can't afford to do a full install, but we want to do a phased install. So if there's any leniency that can be considered for that, the moment we invest and then we want to expand and it nullifies, that could curb all of our to-date resources. So we've been planning for that. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Kate Bowman with Utah Clean Energy. To start off, I just wanted to say thank you for having this forum and all the work that you've put into this. I know it's been an incredible amount of time and energy, and I think whenever I've made it to the Kaysville City Council meetings, you really set the bar in terms of having a transparent, open process and inviting and making time for residents to get involved. So I think it's wonderful, and it's great to hear so many good ideas coming from your recommendations and then from the folks who live here in Kaysville. And you've got a great community, and I'm really impressed always by the opportunity for discussion back and forth. And so I have a few comments on and for you to consider. And I think you're all very aware that what setting rates is one part, looking at the numbers, which you've done in really great detail, and really digging in and understanding the numbers. And then another part of it is figuring out how do you convert that into a rate that people will understand and know how to respond to, and make something that's simple and transparent. And those two parts are both very important. So I'll save some comments that are more related to the policy aspect of it for when you present this to the council and have that discussion, and focus a little more on recommendations and questions related to the study as you've presented it right now and some of this discussion tonight. And so first, just some comments related to when this is presented before the city council. I think it seems like it might be helpful for some folks to have sample bills for different types of customers available. And so even as someone who spends a lot of time, looking at kilowatt hours and kilowatts, it's sometimes hard to understand what that would really mean. And it might be helpful to see, here's someone who's, on the lower end of the energy usage spectrum living in an apartment, and here's what their bill would look like. Here's someone who's, has a big house, a pool, air conditioner. Here's what their bill would look like, just to give people an idea of, what are the impacts that you're really talking about, and how will this affect Kaysville residents. And then second, I've heard people mention a couple times tonight the additional benefits that weren't considered in this study, and not because they're not necessarily quantifiable, but they're not benefits that your power company's paying, even if they may be benefits that are providing benefits to all Kaysville residents. So the social and health benefits of cleaner power, the benefit of having money reinvested here in your community in the form of people saving money on their utility bills, and solar jobs and people installing solar up on your rooftops instead of sending it off to a power company elsewhere. And I think it would be interesting, and I wonder if you would consider presenting some information or having someone present some information about some of those benefits to the City Council when they consider this study, so they can look at the two together and make a more informed decision about both the numbers and then what are some of the other things that are valuable, and have a conversation about if there's other value to Kaysville residents. And then related to the grandfathering, there's been a few comments about the grandfathering term of 15 years. And you're likely aware Rocky Mountain Power recently approved 19-year grandfathering for existing solar customers. And most utilities around the country that have chosen to grandfather have done 20 or more year grandfathering terms. I'm not sure why Rocky Mountain Power just couldn't bear to give people that extra year and go to 20. But it is typical to have a longer grandfathering term, and 25 years also makes sense because that's the warranted lifetime of the panels. So that's sort of what people use in their calculations when they're looking at their payback. And your proposal, as you presented it, this is something that was also brought up, would be effective based on the date that the solar installation is installed. And as it seems like you have a lot of people here who install solar themselves, but even going with a solar company, there can be all sorts of delays associated with installing solar, especially in the winter and around the end of the year. And so Rocky Mountain Power's cutoff is actually when you file your interconnection agreement with the utility, and the permit would be another way to do it. But there's a 1-year limit on, you have to get the system installed by 1 year, so it's not like you can file the interconnection agreement and sit on it forever. But that way, you can get that paperwork in, and you know that you'll be able to get the price you think that you will, even if your installer can't get up on your roof because it's snowing or something like that. And then last, there were a couple of questions about what happens if someone wants to expand their system. And I think that's a question that I've been getting a lot related to the Rocky Mountain Power settlement. And a lot of people do want to add an electric car. They want to add more panels as their family grows, or just because they didn't have the budget to do it the first time around. So I would think about, and it sounds like you're planning to put forth a more clear recommendation on exactly how someone who expands their system would be affected. And it seems one reasonable way to do it would to allow people to expand their systems up to a certain amount. So if they have a 6 kilowatt array and they're making it an 8 or a 9, that's probably not a very significant change for the utility. If they want to go put 50 kilowatts on there for some reason, that's a different scenario. So that might be one way to consider it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Good evening again. Ryan Evans with the Utah Solar Association. Just a few thoughts, and I want to echo what I've heard a lot tonight. I think probably my greatest moment tonight is just seeing the community response. I anticipate you'll see people additionally on the 5th, and I think that's great that people are getting out and making their feelings heard, which is great. Kind of just building upon what Kate just alluded to, some of your other customers alluded to. A couple things that I just want to do an addition and not rehash things that have been said at this point. Number one, Jordan, maybe it's something that I need to work with you on, but the 5% impact from the current net metering structure to the proposed net metering structure, I have not been able to make that work. And so I would love to try to figure out how that's possible, given that the average customer exports 50 to 60% of their energy. It's about a 23% difference from your current rate. That 5% seems very off to me, and so I think in transparency, let's try to find a way to actually make that a visible number, or as Kate said, use a couple different bills of different customer profiles, whether low load, high load, et cetera. Additionally, I think there's a lot of other fees, and I'm curious if they've been built in, but permitting fees, inspection fees, local sales tax, all of these things are come back into the budget, and I think they're worth a value there. When we're talking about externalities, there are externalities that are very quantifiable. And should we slow down the number of solar installations, which no doubt, obviously, when you decrease the value of it, you will decrease the amount of solar installations that will decrease that external economic development impact number that's at the local level. And so there is a number, it's quantifiable. There's also transmission efficiencies. Does that transformer last longer? Because you've got 3 residents within a neighborhood that are saving, that are importing or consuming 40 to 40% each less daily, that does help the system retain its value longer. And so even though solar customers maybe shouldn't be able to avoid the distribution fee, should they get a little credit for where they're possibly enhancing the distribution system? And I think that's a worthy thing to consider in this particular discussion, again, aside from the City Council. One thing I will say, too, in regard to expanding system sizes, there is the ability even within the Rocky Mountain Power Settlement to actually expand it up to about 10 kW. So if you go above 10 kW, then you forfeit your grandfathering. But I think you could even do it on a percentage basis. If you have a 7 kW system and you want to put another, 10% on, or, whatever that number is to help more people adopt electric vehicles to bring down load, I think that's a worthy thing, and it should not impact grandfathering at that level if it's not a material difference in increase, and especially back to what you've got a use for it. You can show them buying an electric vehicle or whatever that may be. I will go back to also 20 years grandfathering. I think it's an important principle based on financing for customers. This is a rate that Kaysville has offered. Yes, rates can change any time, but I do think that that's a consideration that people have made in this investment. It hasn't been voted upon yet. Let's try to give those people, the right number. Agreed as well on, a net metering application fee or a permit fee, but give them a little time before they're lumped into that new customer class. I think probably of everything, though, that I've heard, I think my biggest challenge, and I said it last time, and I just want to reiterate this time. This one's so hard for me to get through is we will be, Kaysville will approve this new rate, hopefully, soon. It would be nice to move forward, of course, with something new. But customers who come on and say the next 3 years before those AMI meters are fully deployed and you move to a TOU rate structure, they likely will want to have a different array under this export credit discounting versus time of use, a time of use scenario. And I know that's a challenge for this board, and I totally get that. I think the one thing that I kind of thought may be a mid-step in that is to allow customers the option of switching over to TOU or tying anybody that comes on in the next 3 years to the same length of grandfathering period that you offer regular customers. You're keeping all of them on anyway. And so what's the harm in bringing them in? You don't give them each 15 years. You don't give them an additional 15 or 20 years, whatever you settle upon. But if, let's just use your 15-year date of 2033 is when that grandfathering period ends, at least give those customers that come on in the next 3 years that rate structure guaranteed through this transition process to TOU, because chances are they would develop a very different system under the two scenarios. And I don't think that's a very hard thing. You will very grossly limit solar over the course of the next 3 years, at least until you've made TOU. Additionally, I feel that the export rates, yes, we talked about they could be credited more with externalities, other issues to consider. I think that we have an opportunity here where I love the battery recommendation, for example. Green Mountain Power in Vermont is doing the exact same thing, where Green Mountain Power is actually helping subsidize batteries for all of their residents. Any resident who wants it gets it at a very discounted rate because it's of great value to the utility to have peak covered with cheaper power that's been filled up at other times. Same thing with your peak demand charge. I noticed in that peak solar, excess credit, it's very heavily discounted, and I would think at that point you may actually be able to help shift your peak with solar production if you were to offer that peak period longer and or at a little bit higher level to help people be more incentivized to install west-facing panels. And so just a consideration I would throw at you. And especially given the fact that you will be buying a solar customer's power for, say, 10 cents at that peak, chances are it's going to the next door neighbor who will be paying 14 cents for it at that point as a residential customer. And that 4 cents is the value of the distribution from one house to the next house. And I think that's a worthy consideration to at least include as a thought. I think that's probably all I'll kill you on today. But thank you very much for all of this. You know that I appreciate it. I've said it a million times, and I'll keep saying it. I really do appreciate the open and transparent process. It's just amazing. Even here, how many new questions come up. I see it in your eyes. Each time someone comes up and asks something, we're going to have to check on that. And I want to be here to help that too, and I just want to, wherever I can help guide that process so that you do have as much solar that makes sense for the community as possible is the best result. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any last questions? Okay, we're gonna take a 10-minute break, and then we'll continue on with our regular power board meeting.